Shabbat Shalom, everybody. I'm so glad that you are all here, spiritedly dressed, ready for Shabbat, ready for St. Patrick's Day, ready for whatever comes your way. I'm Rabbi Sarah Berman. I'm the Director of Adult Education here at Central Synagogue, and it is my honor, my pleasure, to introduce our speaker for this afternoon's program. Orly Erez-Likhovski is the director of the Israel Religious Action Center in Jerusalem. She's been director since 2021, having taken over for Anat Hoffman. She was formerly the director of IRAC's legal department from 2014 to 2021. In that role, Orly has won major cases regarding making gender discrimination or gender segregation on public transit illegal, expanding state-funded rabbinic salaries beyond just the Orthodox community to include our friends and our dear ones in Israel in the Reform movement as well. She worked on a successful class action lawsuit on the exclusion of women in public spaces, and she has successfully worked to bar racist candidates for running for national office. For education, she got her BA from Tel Aviv University and studied law here at Columbia University. Orly is a dear friend to Central Synagogue, to many of us here, and we're so thrilled to welcome her to our community this evening in this program and a little bit later from our bima across the street. Orly, welcome.
Thank you, Rabbi Sarah, and hello, hi everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you. I'm actually been in the United States for quite a while now, for 2.5 weeks. Started at the West Coast and concluding my trip here, going back to Israel next week. I want to tell you a little bit about the Israel Religious Action Center, what we have been working on for the past decade or so. And then I'll talk a little bit about the current situation in Israel, which is a little problematic to say the least. And of course, and I'll leave plenty of time for questions, and I'll be really happy to answer any questions or comments that you have. So the Israel Religious Action Center is the public, legal and public advocacy arm of the Reform movement in Israel. I myself have been working at IRAC for almost 20 years. And we've been working since 1997 to promote justice, equality, pluralism, and tolerance in Israeli society. We've focused on 4 main issues in the past decade or so, and I want to tell you a little bit about each of those issues. Freedom of religion and equality to the liberal streams, fighting against gender segregation and for women's rights, fighting against racism, and helping our legal aid center for Orly or new immigrants. So starting with the issue of freedom of religion, you know that in Israel there is no separation between religion and state, and so the government funds heavily religious services, but when we're talking about Judaism, it funds, or did fund until we challenged this, almost exclusively Orthodox Judaism or ultra-Orthodox Judaism. Under the current Israeli legal system, we'll talk a little bit about it later, Israel is a democracy, and that's why the government should act in an equal manner toward the different religious streams of Judaism. But because it did not do so, we had to take the state to court for each and every context to demand equal treatment. And that's what we did. We basically challenged the current situation when we stated that to the Supreme Court that the state should fund our rabbis, Reform and conservative rabbis across Israel, and we indeed managed to do it, and we broke the Orthodox monopoly around 10 years ago, and this, since 2013, the state has begun to fund the salaries of Reform and conservative rabbis. We have also demanded and started to receive funding for our synagogue buildings, either from the government or from different municipalities. We also had a very long legal struggle on the issue of conversion, requiring the state to basically recognize Reform and conservative conversions for the purpose of the law of return. And this very long legal battle ended 2 years ago when the Supreme Court decided to accept or to recognize our conversions for the purpose of the law of return. And we also have a very long legal struggle on the issue of the Western Wall, demanding a real alternative of an egalitarian prayer at the wall. We have today an egalitarian plaza, but it's not a real alternative. We do not receive the same funding as the segregated plaza. We do not have any say in how the place is being run, and there is a lot of violence which still occurs at the wall. Just 2.5 weeks ago, I argued before the Supreme Court on the issue of the Western Wall on a petition we have for quite some time, which is pending before the court, Not much has been achieved in this hearing. We're just waiting for another decision of the court or another update of the state in a couple of months. So that's just a little bit about the issue of freedom of religion and equality for the liberal streams. Moving on to the issue of women's rights. We have identified the dangerous trend of gender segregation in the public sphere, which started around 25 years ago with demands of the ultra-Orthodox leaders to impose gender segregation in a variety of contexts. It started with the issue of gender segregation on buses, where women were ordered to board a bus from the back door and sit at the back of the bus. I know that it sounds unbelievable to you, but I can tell you that at first Israelis were not so shocked and said, okay, just a few bus lines, let the ultra-Orthodox live the way they want to live. We filed a petition to the Supreme Court against this when we found out that women who refused to sit at the back of the bus were harassed, sometimes even physically. And then an amazing thing happened because we had ultra-Orthodox women call us and tell us, we thank God that there are reforms in the world because you are fighting the fight that we cannot allow ourselves to fight. We're against this, but we cannot go against this publicly. And so it was clear that it's not the will of all of the ultra-Orthodox sector. There are a variety of voices within the society, as in any society. And for many years, the government has just, did what the most extreme people within this ultra-Orthodox society demanded. And we took the case to court, and the Supreme Court declared gender segregation on public buses illegal. And since then, we have helped women who drivers continue to send them to the back of the bus to file civil suits for damages against those bus drivers, and we won most of those cases. Actually, the last case we won just a couple of weeks ago. It's a case that happened in 2019. And believe it or not, it was a woman who wanted to board a bus in Jerusalem. The bus driver got off the bus, blocked the entrance to the bus, and told her there is room for only 12 men. You cannot board the bus because you're a woman. So we sued the bus and the bus driver, and we won, and he's going to pay her damages. So these things still happen. We also have a lot of cases on issues of gender segregation in cemeteries. In Israel, cemeteries are run mostly by ultra-Orthodox burial societies, and some of them try to impose gender segregation on the grieving family, at the hardest time of a family's life, sometimes even not allowing women to eulogize their loved ones, and we have quite a few cases against different burial societies in this regard. Rabbi Sarah mentioned the class action suit that we filed. This was filed against an ultra-Orthodox radio station, which did not allow women to be heard on air. I'm not talking about women singing, but rather women talking, and that has no halachic basis whatsoever. It was just an invention. But for 2.5 years, women were not allowed to be heard on this station. So if there was a press conference and a female politician spoke, then they stopped the broadcasting. God forbid you can't hear her voice on the radio station. And if there was a program where listeners could call and talk, the female listeners had to send a fax. It was a long time ago, so people still use the fax. We decided to file a class action suit, and we did it after we found through a survey that around a third of the ultra-Orthodox women who listened to the station felt humiliated and were against this exclusion of women, and it's a large number. It's approximately 40,000 women. People told us, well, once we put women on air, nobody would listen to the station. Then what will you do? You'll just, bring to its closure. But the reality was the complete opposite. Once they started putting women on air, just more and more people listened. So it was clear that people actually wanted to listen to a variety of voices, both male and female. We won this class action suit. It was a groundbreaking decision. And the station was ordered to pay 1 million shekels in damages. The money went to programs which empowered ultra-Orthodox women. So that's just another case. We have a lot of other cases, and I'll be maybe talk about them a little later, but I have still more to tell you. So moving on to the third issue, fighting racism. We fight for many, many years against people who use the Jewish religion to incite against Arabs, to incite violence and hatred and intolerance. Some of them are rabbis who are in formal posts, so rabbis who are employed by the state as part of the religious service system in Israel and use their post to instead of, to bring people together, to rather pull people apart. In Israel, incitement to racism is a criminal offense, and we demand that those people be brought to justice. And indeed, we've had success in this demand. And also, when we're talking about a person who is employed by the state, we also demand that he undergoes disciplinary charges because he's under a stronger duty to act respectfully toward many others. And we've had the Supreme Court accept our petition against a city rabbi employed by the state who for many years incites against Arabs. And the court said that he should undergo disciplinary proceedings because he's not allowed to do so. So this was really important. Another issue which Rabbi Sarah mentioned in her introduction was our demand to disqualify racist candidates from running to the Knesset, to Israel's parliament. After Rabbi Meir Kahana was elected to the Knesset, to the Israel's parliament in the 1980s, the Knesset changed the law, and today Israeli law states that anybody who incites to racism can be disqualified from even being allowed to run to the parliament. But the court never accepted those requests because the courts demanded a lot of evidence to show that people are extreme racists in order to prevent someone from being elected, because it's a very important right in the democracy. But 4 years ago, we managed to do so. We we wanted 4 people to be disqualified. They're all members of the racist Jewish Strength Party. The Supreme Court accepted our petition and disqualified 3 of them. The 4th one, unfortunately, was not disqualified. His name is Itamar Ben-Gvir, and he is now a Minister of Internal Security in Israel. And I can't believe that I'm even saying this, but that's the reality today. By the way, the court said he was very close to being disqualified, but the court said that he didn't pass the line. But that was, again, a groundbreaking decision because it did draw the red line as to who is allowed and who is not allowed to be a part of Israel's parliament. We also have another class action suit which is still pending. This is a suit against an app like Uber. It's called in Hebrew, in Israel, Get. It's a cab company app. And in Jerusalem, they have a special service. It's called Get Mehadrin. And that's a service of seemingly cabs which do not drive on Shabbat. But it actually promises you will get a Jewish driver in the cab. So obviously it discriminates against Arab drivers, and in Jerusalem around half of the cab drivers are Arab. So we filed a civil suit, which is still a class action suit, which is still pending, and we hope to abolish this discriminatory and racist practice. We also opened 6 years ago a racism crisis center, and we offer legal assistance and mental health assistance to victims of racism in cases such as racial profiling or refusal to grant services on the basis of race. And finally, the 4th issue is our legal aid center for Olim, for new immigrants. We have been helping around 1,000 people each year in their effort to acquire status in Israel. And in the past year, we've helped dozens of people from Ukraine and Russia, people who flee the war in Ukraine, heartbreaking cases, such as a case of a girl, 14-year-old girl, who is a grandchild of a Jew, and that's why she's not allowed to enter Israel under the law of return. But her parents and brother were here, and she was stuck in Ukraine with her grandma, and only after we intervened, she was allowed to enter Israel. Our center, this center also assists humanitarian cases, such as foreign women who married Israeli husbands and were in the gradual process of acquiring citizenship through the marriage, but then they had to leave their husband because of domestic violence. And then the Ministry of Interior told them, you have this cruel choice to make. Either you stay with your abusive husband and get citizenship, or you leave him and you're kicked out of the country. And this happens even if they have Israeli kids who were born in Israel, and that's why they're Israeli citizens. We help dozens of such women, and indeed we see some sort of change, and more and more are allowed to stay in Israel. So that's just a very general overview of some of the things we're doing. And as you probably figured out, the main tool that we use is the legal tool, because when you're a minority and you want to challenge the government's practices, you go to the court, which is supposed to protect human rights. And this is now under a big threat of the new government. We're talking about a government which is the most extreme, racist, homophobic, and misogynistic government Israel has ever had, and really stands up against all the values that we believe in. I can tell you that most Israelis are not with the government when we're talking about issues of religious pluralism, of women's rights, of gay rights. Most Israelis are for those values and are against extremism. The liberal camp was very very badly disorganized this past elections, and that's why we found ourselves with this result. And what I should also say is that the Israeli legal system as it is very fragile. Okay? Israel is a very fragile democracy in the sense that we do not have a formal, rigid constitution. We do not have a detailed Bill of Rights. We have a very, very sensitive balance between the different branches. The government completely controls the parliament, and so the only checks and balances on the power of the government is the Supreme Court. And indeed, we have gone to the Supreme Court, who helped us for in a variety of cases. The government has been, the right-wing government have been saying for many, many years that the Supreme Court is too active and is actually running the state, and that's why they should rebalance the relationship between the branches. I can tell you, as someone who has been appearing and arguing before the court maybe 100 times in the past 20 years, that the court is anything but active. Okay, in our cases, they are so cautious. They try as much as they can to beg the government to change their opinion, to change their decision, and the government does not do so, and then at the end, they do intervene. I gave you the example of the Kotel, the Western Wall petition. We had this hearing, and what happened is that the court told the government, okay, you said things should be improved, please tell us in 3 months, update us what happened. They didn't force the government to do anything. The conversion case, which we won 2 years ago, was decided after 15 years that the court has waited for the Knesset to do something. At the end, they said, we have petitioners. They are waiting. They want to acquire citizenship through their conversion, and we have to help them. So it is clear that contrary to what there is this incitement against the court is not, in my opinion, not active enough. But nevertheless, that's what the government has been saying, that the balance should be shifted. And what they want to do now is to create a situation where the government would have complete control over nomination of judges of the nomination committee in Israel that nominates judges. They want to make it almost impossible for the Supreme Court to strike down laws. Today, the court strike down laws. In Israel, there are around 15 justices in the Supreme Court. But in contrary to what happens here in the US Supreme Court, they sit usually in panels of 3. It's not the whole court sitting together. However, in important cases, such as cases involving striking down laws, they sit in panels of usually 9 or 11 justices. Now they want to decide that they'll have to sit with a full panel of 15 justices, and that they will need to have a majority of 12 justices in order to strike down law, and that's a very hard majority to answer to. They're also saying that any law entitled basic law would not be able to be struck down at all. Now, you have to understand that we don't have a constitution. Instead, we have basic laws, which are supposed to be higher than regular laws. Only 2 of them relate to human rights. But in Israel, because we don't have a constitution, basically the Knesset could pass any law and just say it's called basic law, and that's it. Now it's higher than a law and wouldn't have any, the court could not be able to strike it down. It does not have a special process. It's basically like any other law. And so if they will now decide that any law titled basic law couldn't be challenged by the court, then basically the government could do whatever it wants and just call it a basic law, which of course doesn't make any sense. They also wanted to decide that even if we got the majority of the Supreme Court judges that say that a law should be, invalidated, then the Knesset could override this decision and decide nevertheless to enact the law. Actually, under one of the versions, they actually say we don't have to wait for the court's decisions. In advance, we'll say in the law, this is a law that cannot be struck down by the court, so we would immune it from the start. So it really makes the court, we will not be the court at all. And they also want to change the status of the Attorney General and the legal advisors of the different governmental ministries, basically saying that the government would be allowed to ignore the legal opinion of the Attorney General. So if the Attorney General says, okay, what you want to do is illegal, they could say, okay, we'll do it anyway. We don't care what you're saying. And all this creates really a situation like in no other Western democracy, okay, with no checks and balances and basically placing the government above the law. This is the current situation, and it's very, very troubling and concerning. But we have some good news, and the good news is that Israelis are not sitting aside, but fighting for the values we believe in, fighting for equality, fighting for liberalism, fighting for dignity for all. And for the past 10 weeks, actually tomorrow it's going to be the 11th week, Israelis have gone out to the streets in growing numbers. So last Shabbat, we were talking about 500,000 Israelis protesting in over 100 places all across Israel. If we're talking about the US, it would be the equivalent of 16 million Americans going out of the streets for 10 weeks straight. This has never happened in Israel. I don't know if it's ever happened anywhere else in the world. And clearly the government did not foresee such an strong and wide and ongoing opposition and protest to the program. And we can see already that although they want to continue with those bills, the process is much slower than they anticipated. They thought they're going to do it within 2-3 weeks and change the Israeli constitutional system. It didn't happen up until now. And we hear that many people talk about compromise. The president of Israel said we should start a dialogue about what we want to create here in Israel. And, I say also, if you want to have a revolution, a reform, let's sit down, let's talk. I think the real reform we need to have is to strengthen human rights and not to weaken the Supreme Court, to have a real constitution, to have a process according to which you will be able to pass a constitution and amend the constitution and what human rights should be part of it. But this is, of course, something that should take a long time. You can't do it in a month or 2 months or 3 months, and definitely not in 2 or 3 weeks, which is what the government is trying to do. So it's clear that the voice the Israelis are sounding is strong, is amazing, and I think this is very good news because it shows that Israelis understand that political activism is important. They understand they cannot be indifferent and just sit at home and whine, and they understand they have to go and reclaim our country. And if you look at the images from the protests, you see that the color is the Israeli flag, right? You see hundreds of thousands of Israeli flags, and it's sort of reclaiming of the flag. The Israeli flag has been associated in recent years with the extreme right, and now people from all walks of Israeli society say, no, this is our flag. This is our country, those are our values, and we're going to stand for those values. And we see other phenomena like never before. We see people like pilots who say we're not going to reserve duty because if it's not going to be a democracy, we're not going to serve it. We see high-tech people who are saying we're going to take the money out and not invest in the country. And these things are not theoretical, they're already happening. So in this sense, I'm optimistic because I think the government cannot ignore such an wide, strong, and amazing protest. And I want to tell you that I think your voice matters too. Okay, Israel is not only the land of the Israelis, state of the Israelis, it's also the state of all of the Jewish people. It's the homeland of the Jewish people as a whole. And I think this is not only your right, it's also your duty to raise a voice to keep Israel a democracy. And I urge you to talk in any forum, in any organization you're part of, about the need to fight those dangerous initiatives and the need to keep Israel a democracy, to call your elected representatives and to ask them to raise a voice in this regard. I think your voices could definitely matter and could make a difference. And your voices also strengthen us in Israel. I can tell you that a few weeks ago, Rabbi Rick Jacobs gave a speech in the central protest in Tel Aviv. I was with him next to the stage. It was in front of 150,000 Israelis. He spoke for 5 minutes in Hebrew, a very moving speech. And after the speech, I went with him out of the demonstration, trying to catch a cab. And people stopped us on the way and told him how moving his speech was and how important it was for them to hear that American liberal Jews are with Israelis. So that really gives us energy and strengthens us in this fight, which is very difficult and intense. So I think I'm going to stop now and maybe open it up for questions, and I'd be really happy to hear. Okay.
So I'm very happy to help with the moderation. We're actually going to start in the Zoom room where folks have been already adding questions. Yeah.
Excellent.
Great.
So first of all, I just want to say personally, Orly, you are a civil rights hero, and it's such a joy to have you in New York. Thanks for coming. So the first question is an Israel 101 question, because we don't have a parliamentary system. When you say that the government controls the courts, when we translate that into America, we would say, well, our government controls the courts too, because, the president, nominates judges and that goes through the Senate. When you say the term the government, what do you mean?
Well, it's true that in America, you definitely have a political control or involvement in the nomination of judges, but you have to understand that in the US, you have other checks and balances, okay? So you have a constitution, you have the Congress and a presidential veto, you have elections of the different states, in Israel, we don't have any other checks and balances other than the Supreme Court. So if you take this and give the government complete power, meaning that they would have a majority in the committee nominating judges, then it's clear that they're going to nominate judges who will do whatever the government says. And this is something that never happened in Israel before. Now, what the government is trying to do, they're saying, okay, we're having all these elements of this revolution, and they're taking every element from a different country. Okay, so we're taking the override clause, that's something that happens in Canada and Finland. The nomination of judges, that's from America. United Kingdom doesn't have a constitution, but they're actually mixing all those legal systems together and creating a system like nowhere else in the world. So it's true that in America, this is the nomination of judges. By the way, maybe it's a broken system that shouldn't be replicated. I don't know if it's not working very well recently, right? But you definitely cannot take everything and create a system without checks and balances. And I think what I always say is that any one of us could find ourselves in a minority, right? I mean, the people now in government could be minority tomorrow. They will need the protection. Who will protect them? If the government has unrestrained power, then nobody would be able to protect it. So that's, I think, the important point.
Right, and with our system, not that it is perfect in any way, there is a check and balance in that model because one branch of government nominates and the Senate. So and when you are referring to the Israeli government, you're talking about the coalition that is assembled by the majority party after the election.
Right, and also what I said also that the government completely controls the Knesset, and this is something that has been changing over the years because in the Israeli parliamentary system, you always have, the government has to have a majority within the Knesset to form a government. But, years ago, what happened was that if the opposition wanted to offer bills, then the government would sit down and think, okay, maybe it makes sense. Maybe it's a law that we want to support and that could be passed. Now, it's completely polarized. So any bill that the opposition would submit, the coalition would reject and vice versa. So it means that the opposition can't pass any bills and the government controls the Knesset and the Knesset cannot supervise the government because it has no power. So in essence, you don't have any separation between the legislative branch and the executive branch. And now if we're adding the complete control of the government of the courts, then we don't have anything. We just have one branch basically controlling everything.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question from our combined Facebook and Zoom room, which we have about 100 people watching here. And the question is, folks are interested in the criteria for being deemed racist. How is that defined or determined?
So Israeli law says that anyone who preaches to hatred and hostility against a person on the basis of his race or color, this is the definition of racism. But in order to be disqualified from running to the Knesset, as I said, you have to bring a lot of evidence. So we basically brought around 50 to 70 videos and recordings of the people saying in their own voice really horrible remarks, which I don't want to repeat because they're horrible. But and it was also important to bring, clear not just citations from the paper, because then we would say, okay, I was misquoted, but rather really recordings of them actually saying those. And when we brought dozens of such expressions, referring to all of the Arabs as terrorists, everyone should be kicked out, should not be given any rights, then it was clear that they meet the definition of racism, way, way above.
Great, thank you.
So we'll take some questions from here in the room. I'm coming around, I promise. I'm coming around. All right. Ed, do you want to ask the first question?
I have at least 4 million, so I'll just it's almost ridiculous to raise this, but it's one of the questions, it's one of the things that we see back here, which is the ridiculous situation on Rosh Chodesh every month. Which seems to me to get worse and worse because we can see the stream of it and all that whistling and spitting and young people, young women, Haredi women harassing people who are trying to pray. And to me, although it's probably the least significant of all of the things, it's sort of a symbolism of, we're in charge, you're not. And the stalemate just drives a lot of us nuts.
Yeah, the Rosh Chodesh prayer at the wall are indeed unbelievable. I've been attending them since 2016, almost every month. It's like a lunatic house. I mean, it's really if you were not there, it's very or seen it through live stream. It's very hard to understand how this happens month after month in the holiest place for the Jewish people. And nothing changes. It's also amazing because the people who come to harass Women of the Wall and their supporters are very young. So basically, girls and boys, ultra-Orthodox girls and boys, are bused to the Western Wall with one purpose: to basically prevent Women of the Wall from praying. In Rosh Chodesh Adar, a couple of weeks ago, we had a procession with Torah scrolls because the rabbi of the Kotel, who is ultra-Orthodox, does not let us bring Torah scrolls inside the Western Wall. There are 100 Torah scrolls in the wall, but all on the men's side, so women are not allowed to read from the Torah. And then we're trying to get Torah scrolls inside, and the guards, we had thugs, stopping us. Last time, actually, Rabbi Gilad Kariv, who is a member of the Knesset and he has immunity, he brought a Torah scroll in, and he's allowed to do so because he has immunity, because he's a member of the parliament. But then he was surrounded by thugs belonging to the Kotel Heritage Foundation because they wanted him to prevent moving the Torah scrolls, transferring it to us. God forbid a woman would hold the Torah. And I'm actually shouting at the guards. I told them, "What are you afraid of?" So a woman would read from the Torah, the sky not going to fall. But that's going on every month. It's very troubling. I also argued about this before the Supreme Court. Actually, in one of the hearings in our petition a couple of years ago, we actually showed a video. I asked to show a video, and the judges were in a state of shock because really it's unbelievable. The noise and the cursing and the violence that is just recurring is really unbelievable. I can tell you that also a lot of supporters of Women of the Wall come, including members of our mechinot, of our pre-military programs. My daughter also came a couple of years ago. And then you start this really interesting conversations between young girls on both sides. And you see that some of the girls who come to harass us, suddenly our eyes are opened and they're starting to think, to realize that there are other ways to express your Judaism and maybe it's possible. So that's, that gives me a little hope because it's sort of, maybe it opens this crack for them to understand that, they were being taught one thing and maybe hatred toward others. Maybe they'll understand that there are other ways as well.
Thank you so much. Another question from our online community asking, what do you make of the limited participation of Arab Israelis in the public protests?
That's a very good question. I told you that the protests are marked with, the Israeli flag, so they're very Zionist and Jewish. The good thing is that there's a very broad spectrum of people who participate in those protests within the Jewish community, including people who voted for the government. The downside is that the Arabs are not part of this protest. They don't feel part of it, and they also, it's hard for them to come and protect Israel's democracy because they feel that there is no real democracy in Israel for quite a while now. What I say to them is, of course, we have to differentiate between what's happening in the West Bank, which is, of course, not a democracy, between what happens within Israel, which, at least in theory, we have a democratic framework, which, did not work perfectly, right? That's what I've been doing for 20 years, but at least we have something to work with. And now they're going to actually completely shatter it. Today was actually the first demonstration in Arab village in Kfar Manda. It was rather small with 200 people. But I read that Ayman Oda, who is a member of the Knesset of Chadash, of one of the Arab parties, said, we have to understand that we have to choose between bad and worse. And it's true that it's a very hard choice, right? To get people out to the street to say, now it's bad, it's going to get worse. But so I think maybe there is a little understanding, but they are in a very difficult situation, which I completely understand.
We'll come back into the room.
It seems like a parallel universe because 70 to 80% of American Jews are atheists. I don't know what the numbers are in Israel, but the fact that the Orthodox are calling the shot, I would say Genug Shein, enough of this nonsense. They didn't fight during the War of Liberation, and I don't know why they're getting this untoward amount of power in that country and why it's being allowed.
Yeah, it's true that the Orthodox enjoy unproportional political power, and for many years they have been calling the shots because they have been giving the keys to Israel's Judaism. I mean, the governments over the years have given them the key. The good news is that the Israelis are not buying it anymore. So Israelis are voting with their feet, okay? Marriage in Israel is only recognized if it's through the chief rabbinate. But more and more Israelis choose to go and have a reform wedding. And even if it's not recognized, okay, they're a common law couple. they get most of the rights, and if there is a difference, we go and demand the same rights. So there is no civil marriage in Israel. People can go and have a civil wedding outside of Israel, and then it would be recognized. But by the way, if they get a divorce, they'll have to go through the rabbinate. So that's not a good solution to what. So what we tell to couples, you don't have to be registered as married. You can marry through the reform movement, be a common law couple, enjoy all the rights, and then you don't have to do anything with the chief rabbinate. And you see that more and more couples, including Orthodox couples, choose to wed outside of the rabbinate. So the rabbinate is becoming obsolete, and in this sense, it's a good news. And I think more and more Israelis understand that there is more than one way to be Jewish. There is a saying that the synagogue most Israelis don't go to is Orthodox, because as you say, most Israelis are secular. In recent years, the synagogue most Israelis don't go to is also Reform and Conservative. So people understand there is a choice, and it's a hard competition because we don't get funded by the state. But nevertheless, we have more and more people who identify as Reform and Conservative. According to a recent survey from a few years ago, 13% of Israelis identify as Reform or Conservative. That's around 800,000 Israelis, so that's a very large number, and more people choose to have their life cycle events, to celebrate holidays in egalitarian synagogues. So that's a very positive development, and in spite of the strong political power of the ultra-Orthodox, and I can tell you that this protest is also about the fact that the direction that the country is going religious wise. So people are saying we are not going to agree to the fact that the ultra-Orthodox are going to tell us how to live our lives, right? So people are against this. The government just a couple of weeks ago wanted to submit a bill about modest dress in the Western Wall, about the fact that women would not be allowed to have a Torah scrolls in the wall according to law. And there was a big uproar in the Israeli public. People were like, no, we're not going to agree to it. And the government retracted. So it's clear that the Israeli public does not agree with it. And I think that's a very good development.
We have another question from our online community. The question is related to what you shared earlier, your observations about former military or current military or high tech folks joining this coalition, if you will. In fact, this week, former military commanders came to New York City to share their concerns about granting preemptive immunity to soldiers, which would eliminate moral checks and balances during war. What are your observations or feelings about finding yourself in this coalition with maybe some unlikely partners?
I think it's important, those voices that were never heard before are really, really important. We had actually one of the chief of the security service just gave an interview this week to a very prominent TV show in Israel. And he said that what Netanyahu is doing is really bringing, Israel to an abyss. And he never spoke like that before. And we had, the former chief of police who actually gave a speech after Rabbi Rick Jacobs. And he said, if Israel is not going to be a democracy, I don't think the police officers are going to listen to what the government is saying. Now, he's a right-wing person, okay? And he's an Orthodox person, but still that's what he says. And those voices were never heard before. I think those voices are important because, the government keeps saying, oh, it's like the bunch of crazy lefties, anarchists. We don't... you can't tell, nobody of us is anarchist, but you definitely can't call those people who are, the backbones of the security service of Israel anarchists. And they keep saying this is the most dangerous issue for Israel today, not outside threats, but this. And I think those voices are really important to hear.
Another question here in the room.
Thank you. I have some questions as to how the government actually works. Given the fact that there's no written constitution, as I understand it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, there are some laws that exist in Israel today that give the Supreme Court the power to declare a law unconstitutional, or whatever the equivalent phrase is, and that also to change the law that we're debating now requires 3 votes or something like that. And is that case that there's certain laws that are deemed quasi-constitutional, so they can't be declared unconstitutional, and others that are not?
Yeah, so it's very complicated. It's funny because I keep saying that all Israelis have become constitutional law professors, and I think Americans are now as well, because people in Israel didn't know anything about this. So now suddenly people discover all this. So the Supreme Court of Israel was not given explicit power to strike down laws. By the way, the United States Supreme Court wasn't either, right? But the court declared here on this power 230 years ago, so nobody remembers it. In Israel, it was done only in 1995. So it's recent history. And the court declared so because the basic law, human dignity and freedom, which is our sort of Bill of Rights, says that any law should answer certain criteria if it infringes upon the rights enumerated in this basic law. And so the Supreme Court says, okay, if it does not answer this criteria, then it means we have to strike down the law. That's what the Knesset said in this basic law. So in the sense, the basic law is higher than regular laws. There are basic laws which deal with different branches of government. Some of the sections require a supermajority to change, okay? So for instance, the section that says that there are elections every 4 years, you need 80 people in the Knesset to vote to change it. But other clauses, they can be changed like this, 2 members of the Knesset versus 1, new basic law. And that's the problem. Now, part of the compromises that are being, thrown into there now is really let's pass a new basic law which states how can you legislate a basic law, because you don't have it written anywhere. Any law in Israel should go through 3 readings, but it has to be just any accidental majority. So it's very unclear. There is a lot of uncertainty, and if we would have actually wanted to set clear criteria and clear framework and mechanism, it would make sense. If we're doing it in a real deep conversation, not a rushed process, and we're using it not weaken the court, but rather to actually make Israel a stronger democracy and not a weaker one.
One more question from our online audience. So for the many elections that have unfolded over the past several years, we keep hearing that the Israeli left is dead. I think Meretz was voted out of the Knesset.
Israeli left has left, yeah.
Yeah, the Israeli left has left. So they're not earning seats. We don't believe in resurrection in Judaism, but do you think that there are signs of life in the political left?
So as I said, the Israeli left was very, very badly disorganized. Meretz did not pass the threshold, and also one of the Arab parties. So it's clear that the election results does not match specifically the popular vote, okay? Because maybe 200,000 votes were just, thrown to waste. So, and as I said, it's clear that a lot of people now do not who voted for the government would not support it today. Actually, according to a poll from yesterday, if the elections were yesterday, then Netanyahu would get 58 votes for his coalition instead of 64. So he would not have a majority out of 120. So it's clear that people who voted for the government did not mean that they actually wanted to do all of those crazy things that they want to do now. According to surveys, the people who voted to the coalition asked, what do you think is the most important thing the government should do? Only 6% said the legal revolution. Most people said the cost of living, security issues, social polarization. So it's clear it's not on the agenda of the people who voted for the government. Having said that, I think that the protest now, which is amazing because it's so spontaneous and it's really bottom up. Okay, it's not really organized. It's just a lot of people going out to the streets, which is amazing. But the disadvantage is that it's not organized. I think the next step should be how are we going to organize it and channel this amazing energy to lasting political change, to create a real political change that will break Israeli deadlock and hopefully get us, on a better route. I think the problem of the left is not only Israeli, it's a global problem. I think a lot of people in the world do not buy the narrative, the universal narrative of human rights, of globalization. They want the specific sense of belongingness, to be part, to feel like an identity issue, to be part of something. And the left in Israel, and I think elsewhere, was not successful in selling this narrative or in giving you a really compelling and convincing narrative. And I think this is something that we have to think how we're going to do. I don't have the answers, but it's definitely something that any liberal person in Israel should be thinking right now. I think we're in search of leadership. I think one of the definite leaders that I see is Rabbi Gilad Kariv, who is really giving a very clear voice to all of the issues that we care about. And now we have to see whether we're actually going to see a real political change. That's the big next step for us.
So one final question for you before I have to get you across the street for services, and many of us have to go across the street for services. Our final question for you is on behalf of all of us, as American Jews who are committed to a Jewish and democratic Israel, a state that we can love and visit and feel at home in. What is our role in this moment of upheaval? What place do we have in helping create the Israel that we want to see?
So, I think when you see a person you love commit a mistake, it's your role to tell them, listen, don't do it. I think you have a seat at the table. I think a lot of Israelis want to hear your voice. And I don't know if you remember that a few weeks ago, the American ambassador to Israel, Tom Knights, said to Netanyahu, told him, you have to pump the brakes on the current legal revolution. And then one of the ministers responded and told him that America should mind its own business. And then Tom Knights responded saying, I don't think Israel wants that America would mind its own business, right? Because you want America to keep supporting Israel, which is of course true. And what I might add is that Israel is your business. I think Israel is the business of all of us. And I think, of course, I really hope that people would not say, we don't want to hear anything about Israel. I want to tell you, don't give up on us. We need you. And your energy and support really helps us, help the people on the ground that keep on fighting. So I call on you to talk about it, to write op-eds, to ask others, to talk to anyone who can influence the government or the Biden administration to raise a strong voice in this regard. And of course, if you could support us or know others who can support us, it would be tremendously thankful. A really good way to keep updated is to sign up for our weekly newsletter. We're sending out every Monday a newsletter, and Rabbi Sarah Berman is holding now a sign-up sheet, which you're very welcome to sign up on your way out. If you sign your email address and give your name, we'd be happy to send you our email. And also, we sometimes ask, we have like an call to action. A couple of weeks ago in our newsletter, we asked people to send emails to Netanyahu and to the Justice Minister of Israel and to embassies and consulates around the world, and we had more than 15,000 emails sent. So it's another good avenue for you to be able to do that. So thank you so much, and I really appreciate.
Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
We love having you here. We love hearing from you, and we can't wait to hear more from the Bima tonight. Shabbat Shalom, everybody.